In 1618, a group of armed men invades a castle in the heart of Europe. They climb stairs, walk through corridors, enter a room, and find exactly who they were looking for. Two government representatives, Catholics. Without much conversation, the invaders grab the two men, drag them to the window, and simply throw them out. Yes, out the window. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, that's already absurd enough, but that's not the problem. The problem is that this small act, this impulsive decision, was the trigger for a war that would last 30 years. A war that would involve practically all of Europe. A war that would kill millions of people. A war so chaotic that, at many moments, no one seemed to know exactly which side they were fighting for. And the strangest part of all, it all started with a list. About 100 years before that, a man decides to do something that, in theory, seemed quite simple. He takes a hammer, a sheet of paper, and goes to the door of a church. His name was Martin Luther. Now imagine the scene, an important church in the city of Wittenberg, people passing by, normal life. And suddenly, knock, knock, knock. Luther is literally nailing a document to the church door. It wasn't just any announcement, it was a list of 95 direct criticisms of the Catholic Church. Basically, he was saying, the church has completely strayed from what it was supposed to represent. Was not exactly the kind of comment you made at that time, because the Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution, it was power, a lot of power. But here's the detail that changes everything. This criticism didn't stay on that door. Thanks to a relatively new technology called the printing press, Luther's ideas began to spread fast, very fast, and the more people read them, the more people agreed. Suddenly, it was no longer just a monk complaining, it was a movement. And that movement began to divide Europe into two sides. On one side, the Catholics. On the other, the Protestants. Now, the difference between them might have seemed theological, but in practice, it was much simpler to understand. Catholics followed the authority of the Pope. Protestants said, the Bible is enough. Catholics had rituals, tradition, and structure. Protestants wanted something more direct, more simple. And up to this point, everything was fine. Religious disagreements had always existed, but this still wasn't the biggest problem. The problem was that these ideas began to mix with politics. Rulers began to choose sides, regions began to divide, alliances began to form, and little by little, Europe stopped being a continent united by a faith and became a continent divided by opposing beliefs. And when that happens, it doesn't take long for tension to turn into conflict, and that's exactly what began to happen. But it still wasn't war. Not yet. Europe was no longer the same. What had once been a religious issue turned into a political game. Kings, princes, and rulers began to look at that division and think, this could be useful. Because choosing between Catholic or Protestant wasn't just a matter of faith, it was a strategic decision. Some rulers adopted Protestantism, not because they deeply believed in it, but because it meant less power for the Pope and more control over their own territories. Others remained Catholic to maintain strong alliances with major powers of the time, and little by little, the map of Europe began to change. If you looked from afar, it almost looked like a board. Protestant regions on one side, Catholic regions on the other, and in the middle of all this, one specific place began to become the center of tension, the Holy Roman Empire. Now the name sounds big and organized, but in practice it was a mess. More than 300 different territories. Each with its own ruler, each with its own decisions. Some Catholic, others Protestant. Everything coexisting, more or less. To try to maintain some kind of balance, these territories began to organize themselves. The Protestants formed the Protestant Union. The Catholics responded with the Catholic League. Two alliances, two sides, and one problem. Now any small conflict had the potential to turn into something much bigger. It was like stacking barrels of gunpowder in a tense environment. And here comes the interesting part. Even with all this division, no one wanted to be the first to escalate the conflict. Everyone was prepared, but no one wanted to take the first step. It was that kind of tension that seems controlled until the moment someone does something impulsive. And that's exactly what happened in 1618 in the city of Prague, capital of the Kingdom of Bohemia, a place that on the outside seemed stable, but inside was about to explode. Bohemia was mostly Protestant, but who was really in charge? Catholics. And as you can imagine, that wasn't exactly a peaceful combination. The Protestants felt ignored, pressured, losing ground, and for a while, they tolerated it, complained, negotiated, tried to resolve things peacefully, but that still wasn't the biggest problem. The problem was that this tension kept building until it reached a point where it simply couldn't be ignored anymore. So, in May 1618, a group of Protestant nobles decides to act. They go to Prague Castle, enter, and find two Catholic representatives of the Emperor. Now, imagine the scene: a closed room, heavy atmosphere, intense argument, and suddenly, someone makes a decision. They grab the two men, drag them to the window, and throw them out, just like that. By some miracle, both survived the fall, but the damage was already done. That was no longer a political discussion. It was a direct act of rebellion. Worse, it was an open challenge to the emperor's authority. At first, it seemed simple, a local rebellion in Bohemia, something that could be resolved quickly, but it wasn't, because as soon as the conflict began, others started getting involved, and from that moment on, war was inevitable. Phase 1, Bohemia, 1618 to 1625. After the window incident, the Protestants don't back down. Now it's no longer protest, it's open revolt. They organize, form an army, and more importantly, make a bold decision. They reject the Catholic emperor and choose their own king. Now, in their minds, this made sense. They are fighting at home. They know the territory. They have local support. It seemed like a good chance of victory. The problem is who they were facing. On the other side was the Holy Roman Emperor, and behind him, the Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful families in Europe. These guys weren't just powerful, they were dominant. They controlled territories across Europe, had virtually unlimited resources, and professional armies, experienced and disciplined. And most importantly, they couldn't lose, because if they lost Bohemia, they would open the door for other regions to rebel as well. In other words, this war had to be won, and quickly. The Protestants advance, confident, believing they are in control, and then the imperial army appears, organized, heavy, relentless. And it doesn't take long for it to become clear that this will not end well. So what happens? The Protestants are defeated, and it's not a light defeat. The army is destroyed, the leadership is captured and executed, the rebellion simply collapses. Bohemia returns to Catholic control, and for a moment, it seems like it's over. But in reality, this only caught the attention of other players. Phase 2, Denmark, 1625-1629. Now a new participant enters, Denmark. A Protestant kingdom that looks at the situation and thinks, the Catholics are becoming too strong. The Danish king, Christian IV, decides to act, and in his mind, the plan seemed simple. The empire had just crushed a rebellion. Maybe it was tired, maybe it was vulnerable, maybe it was the perfect time to attack. So he enters the war, but there's a problem. On the other side weren't just ordinary soldiers. There were two extremely efficient commanders, Tilly and Wallenstein. And these men did not play defensively. They advanced, fast, organized, leaving no room for error. The Danes enter, try to advance, and are defeated. They try to reorganize, try to advance again, and lose again and again. Each attempt worse than the previous one. And most importantly, they're not just losing battles, they're losing territory. Cities fall, regions are taken. The Danish presence begins to disappear. In the end, Denmark is completely pushed out of the war. And the result is clear. The Catholics not only won, but became even stronger. And now, for the first time, it seemed like the war was over, but it still wasn't the end, because someone was still watching and waiting for the right moment to enter. Phase 3, Sweden, 1630-1635. And then, Sweden enters. But unlike the others, Sweden knew exactly what it was doing. Its king, Gustavus Adolphus, was not just a leader, he was a strategist, and that changes everything. The Swedes enter with a modern army, better organized, more efficient, and for the first time, the Catholics begin to have problems. Now the game turns, the Protestants begin to advance, battles start being won, territories begin to change hands, and for a moment, it seems like the Protestants will win, but like almost everything in this war, it doesn't last long. The King of Sweden dies in battle, and without him, the strength of the advance begins to weaken. And this is where things get confusing, because sides begin to change, alliances begin to break, and no one seems fully loyal to a single side. But the worst was yet to come. Phase 4, France, 1635-1648. France enters the war. Now this should be simple, right? France is Catholic, so it should fight alongside the Catholics. But no, France enters against the Habsburgs, in other words, against the Catholics themselves. And at that moment, the war stops being about religion Now it's about power, influence, control of Europe, because now there is no simple logic anymore. Former allies become enemies, former enemies become allies, and the war escalates. More armies, more battles, more destruction. Cities are looted, villages disappear, the population begins to suffer, and what started as a religious conflict is now total chaos. And as you can imagine, this did not end well. But in the middle of all this, there is one specific figure who perfectly represents just how absurd this war became, and his story is even more unbelievable. His name was John George Thurars of Saxony, an important ruler within the Holy Roman Empire, a respected leader, someone who was supposed to make strategic decisions calmly and logically, but that's not exactly what happened. John George inherited Saxony, and that by itself was already complicated. Because within his territory, there was one very specific city, Wittenberg. Yes, the same city where Martin Luther had started all that confusion 100 years earlier. In other words, he was ruling exactly the heart of Protestantism, but at the same time, he was part of an officially Catholic empire. Now imagine the situation. Any decision he made would upset someone, and that's exactly what began to happen. When the war begins, John George tries to do what seems safest, remain neutral, not commit. Observe. But the war began to get closer. Armies passed through his territories. Villages were looted. The population began to suffer. And then he has to choose. First, he supports the Protestants. Then he switches to the Catholic side. Then he goes back to the Protestants. And then he switches again. Yes, he basically treated alliances as if they were optional. It seemed like he was trying to survive in a game he clearly did not control. At some moments, these changes even worked. He gained titles, gained recognition. It seemed like he was doing well, but that didn't last long because each new change of side created new enemies. And little by little, Saxony begins to suffer the consequences. More invasions, more defeats, more destruction. And at this point, the situation was already completely out of control. But there's a detail that makes all of this even more absurd. While all of this was happening, John George developed a peculiar habit. He began to drink a lot. But this wasn't social drinking, it was something completely out of the ordinary. According to reports, he consumed the equivalent of dozens of liters of alcohol in a single day, something like 80 modern beers. Yes, the ruler responsible for military and political decisions was basically drunk, frequently, and that starts to explain a lot. While Europe was burning, while cities were being destroyed, while millions were suffering, John George was there, making questionable decisions and drinking as if nothing was happening. He even earned a nickname, Beer George, or George of Beer. And as absurd as that sounds, this was not an exception. It was almost a symbol of the war, a war where important decisions were made amid chaos, pressure, and apparently alcohol. And while leaders like him tried to survive, the situation only got worse. The population began to collapse, the economy began to fall, and the war seemed to have no end. But what finally made this war stop? After decades of war, and something begins to change. It wasn't a great victory. It wasn't a brilliant strategy. It wasn't a heroic moment. It was exhaustion. Just that. After 30 years of fighting, everyone was tired. Weakened armies, destroyed economies, devastated territories. And most importantly, no one was really winning. There were still sides: Catholics, Protestants, France, Habsburgs. But in practice, everyone had already lost something, and a lot. The population paid the price. Entire villages disappeared. Cities were repeatedly looted. Crops were destroyed. And when it wasn't war, it was hunger or disease. In some regions, up to half the population died. Yes, half. Now imagine living in a place like that. No safety, no food, no stability for years. Eventually, the great powers realized something. Continuing to fight no longer made sense. So in 1648, representatives from several countries gather, negotiate, debate, and finally reach an agreement, the Treaty of Westphalia. This treaty officially ends the war, but it does more than that. It reshapes Europe. The Holy Roman Empire loses strength. The Habsburgs stop dominating the region as before. France emerges as a new power. Sweden gains territories. And countries like the Netherlands and Switzerland have their independence recognized. In other words, the map of Europe would never be the same again. And what about John George? After all of this, after all the decisions, all the side switching, all the chaos, he kept living, drinking, and surprisingly, he lived to what was considered an old age for the time, which honestly is already an unexpected ending. When you look at all of this, it becomes clear that this war was never just about religion. It started that way, but it quickly became something else: power, influence, control, and in the middle of it all, human decisions, some intelligent, others completely questionable. And that's what makes this story so absurd, because at the beginning, it was just a criticism nailed to a door. Then it became a division, then tension, then a window, and in the end, a war that changed Europe forever. And perhaps the most impressive part of all this is realizing that at many moments, no one really had control of the situation. History simply got out of control. And when that happens, the consequences are always much greater than anyone could imagine.